All right, guys, we're going to just go over a few properties of parallelograms. So let's take a look and see what we have. First, you have to know what a parallelogram is. So let's go ahead and draw one out. A parallelogram is basically a quadrilateral that has two pairs of parallel sides. So we usually mark it like that with two arrows and one arrow going in parallel directions to each other. And that creates a few special properties. First of all, in a parallelogram, one of the big properties is the opposite sides are going to end up being congruent to each other, and that just means that they're going to have the same length. So if I have a parallelogram that has two sets of opposite sides, that means those two will be equal to each other in length, and so will those. Property two, quadrilateral is a parallelogram. That means opposite angles are congruent. And by the way, the symbol for congruent is basically an equal sign with a squiggly mark above it. To mark opposite angles being congruent, we would just say something with a little curve on the angles, something like this, maybe one curve there and there. That means those have the same measure. And those pair would have the same measure as well. All right. Talking about a quadrilateral is a parallelogram if consecutive angles are supplementary. Supplementary means they add to 180 degrees. And so that would look something like this. You can draw yourself a parallelogram. And let's say you have an angle here, we'll call it X. Well, we know that opposite angles are congruent, so that would be X. This angle here is just going to be 180 minus X. Same with over here. So that means any two angles that are next to each other, they add to 180 degrees. So those two angles add to 180, those two angles add to 180, and so forth and so forth. So those two add to 180, and those two add to 180. Consecutive angles are supplementary. And finally, the last property that we really deal with on you can put a couple other properties in there, but the last property we deal with is in a parallelogram, diagonals, they bisect. Bisect means cut in half. Now, a diagonal in a parallelogram is basically a segment that connects opposite corners. So if I were to draw a diagonal, that would look something like this. Take a parallelogram and connect one corner to the opposite. That's a diagonal. And when I say bisect, I mean they cut each other in half, which means that this segment here would be the same as that, and those two are equal to each other. So we can solve a varied amount of problems using those four properties alone. When we get into more special parallelograms, talking about rectangles, squares, and rhombuses, we'll add a couple other properties there. But for starters, we'll use these properties to solve the following problems.